The cheapest thing at that wedding was not the decorations. It was the way they treated me. I learned that lesson standing in a second-hand ivory dress beneath a rented white arch while 70 guests watched my humiliation unfold as if it were part of the entertainment. My name is Margaret Bennett. I was 68 years old on the day my son married Vanessa Bennett. Looking back now, I should have understood that the wedding was never really about love. It was about appearances. It was about status. And most of all, it was about making sure everyone knew where I belonged. The ceremony took place at a small community garden outside Columbus, Ohio. I paid for nearly everything myself. The flowers came from local growers. The folding chairs were rented. The cake was simple. The musicians were students from a nearby college. Nothing was extravagant. Every dollar represented years of careful saving after my husband George passed away. I wanted my son to have a beautiful day, even if I could not give him luxury. For months, I worked tirelessly. I met vendors, signed contracts, folded invitations, arranged seating charts. I even spent evenings hand-tying ribbon around party favors because hiring extra help would have exceeded the budget. Vanessa rarely thanked me. At the time, I told myself she was stressed. Brides often were. The warning signs appeared long before the wedding. Vanessa complained about the venue. She complained about the menu. She complained about the guest list. Every suggestion I made seemed wrong. Every effort seemed insufficient. Still, I continued smiling because Ryan loved her. That morning I arrived before sunrise to help prepare the garden. Dew covered the grass. The air felt cool and peaceful. For a few hours, I allowed myself to believe everything would be worth it. Then the guests began arriving. I noticed the whispers almost immediately. Some people commented on the modest decorations. Others laughed about the simple buffet. A few openly compared the wedding to more expensive events they had attended. Each remark stung, but I ignored them. My focus remained on Ryan. He looked happy. That mattered more than anything. After the ceremony, guests gathered near the reception tent. I was carrying a tray of drinks when Vanessa approached me. Her smile looked perfect from a distance. Up close, it felt different. Cold. Calculated. Several people stood nearby. Family members. Friends. Neighbors. Vanessa glanced at my dress and laughed softly. Then she made a remark about how the entire wedding looked exactly like something I would organize. The group around her laughed. Before I could respond, she stepped closer. What happened next froze the entire moment in my memory. A deliberate act of disrespect. Small enough to avoid a scene. Public enough to leave no doubt about its meaning. For a second, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I looked down at my dress. Then I looked around at the faces surrounding me. Some seemed shocked. Others looked uncomfortable. Most simply looked away. The person who hurt me most was Ryan. He stood only a few feet away. And he said nothing. I felt the weight of every sacrifice I had made pressing against my chest. Years of love. Years of support. Years of believing family would stand together when it mattered. I quietly set the tray on a nearby table. I straightened my shoulders. I forced myself to smile. Because at that moment, everyone believed I had lost. What none of them knew was that the real story had not even begun. I left the reception earlier than anyone expected. Not because I wanted attention. Not because I hoped someone would stop me. The truth was far simpler. I suddenly felt exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that settles deep inside a person after years of pretending not to notice things that are painfully obvious. The drive home took 40 minutes. During that entire trip, my phone remained silent. No calls. No messages. Not even from Ryan. The silence hurt more than the humiliation itself. I kept thinking about the little boy I had raised alone after George died. The boy who used to leave handwritten notes on the refrigerator before school. The boy who cried when our old dog passed away. The boy who once told me I was the strongest person he knew. Somewhere along the way, that boy had disappeared. When I arrived home, I carefully hung my dress in the hallway closet. I remember staring at it for several seconds. The fabric was inexpensive. Nothing about it had ever been impressive. Yet I had worn it proudly because it represented love. It represented family. Now it felt like evidence from a trial I never agreed to attend. I made myself a cup of tea and sat alone at the kitchen table. The house felt unusually quiet. George had been gone for nearly 12 years, but that night I missed him more than I had in a long time. He always had a way of seeing through people. More than once, he had warned me that kindness without boundaries often attracted the wrong kind of gratitude. At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious. Now I wondered whether he had understood something I refused to see. As the evening passed, memories began surfacing one after another. I remembered the first time Vanessa entered our lives. She was 24 and struggling financially. Her apartment lease had ended unexpectedly. She had nowhere stable to stay. Ryan asked whether she could live with us temporarily. I agreed without hesitation. Weeks became months. During that period, I helped her in every way I could. I covered groceries when money was tight. I paid for certification courses she wanted to take. I watched her grow more confident as she built her career. Whenever she thanked me, she called me family. Looking back, that word feels different now. Family. Such a simple word. Such an easy word to say. Much harder to prove. The memories continued. I remembered helping her choose interview outfits. Driving her to appointments when her car broke down. Sitting beside her in emergency rooms when she felt overwhelmed. None of those moments had ever felt like sacrifices. That was what made the wedding hurt so much. I had not been insulted by a stranger. I had been discarded by someone I genuinely loved. Around 10 o'clock that evening, my phone finally rang. For a brief second, I hoped it was Ryan. It was not. The caller was my longtime friend Helen Foster. The moment she heard my voice, she asked whether I was all right. There was something unusual in her tone. Concern, yes. But something else too. Hesitation. As though she had been debating whether to tell me something important. What Helen revealed during that conversation would force me to reconsider almost everything I believed about Vanessa and the years leading up to that wedding day. Helen did not waste time with small talk. After asking whether I had made it home safely, she became unusually quiet. I could hear her taking a breath on the other end of the line. Then she said something that immediately captured my attention. "Margaret, there are things you do not know." Those 6 words changed the direction of the entire evening. I sat down slowly and listened. Helen explained that over the past few years, she had attended several social events where Vanessa spoke about me when I was not present. At first, Helen assumed it was harmless frustration. Families disagreed sometimes. People complained. That was normal. What concerned her was how often the stories seemed completely disconnected from reality. According to Vanessa, I was controlling. According to Vanessa, I constantly interfered in their lives. According to Vanessa, I used money to manipulate Ryan. The description sounded so different from the person I knew myself to be that I almost laughed. Then Helen told me something that made my stomach tighten. Many people believed those stories. Not because they had witnessed any of it. Because Vanessa repeated them consistently over time. The pattern felt strangely familiar. I remembered moments when neighbors seemed distant for reasons I could not explain. I remembered awkward silences during family gatherings. I remembered conversations that ended abruptly when I entered a room. At the time, I assumed I was imagining things. Now I wondered whether something else had been happening behind the scenes. Helen continued speaking. She described lunches, birthday parties, and community events where Vanessa subtly shaped people's perceptions. Never dramatic accusations. Never obvious lies. Just carefully placed comments. Little suggestions. Small observations. The kind that slowly influence how others see someone. By the end of the call, I felt less angry than I did disappointed. The realization hurt because it explained so much. For years, I believed certain relationships had simply drifted apart naturally. Now I was beginning to see that someone had been quietly rewriting my reputation while smiling to my face. After we hung up, I sat alone in the dark kitchen for nearly an hour. The house remained silent around me. I thought about every sacrifice I had made. Every holiday dinner. Every ride to an appointment. Every check written when Vanessa needed help. None of those memories made sense beside the image she had apparently created. Around midnight, I finally walked upstairs. Sleep never came. Instead, I found myself opening old photo albums stored in a hallway cabinet. Page after page revealed moments I had almost forgotten. Vacations, birthdays, graduation parties. Vanessa appeared in many of them. Smiling, laughing, standing beside me with her arm around my shoulder. Looking at those photographs felt surreal. The public version of our relationship seemed completely different from the private reality Helen had described. As I turned another page, a folded document slipped from between two photographs and landed on the floor. At first I assumed it was an old receipt. Then I recognized George's handwriting on the outside. My heart immediately began beating faster. George had been careful about saving important papers. If he had hidden something inside the album, there was usually a reason. I picked it up slowly and stared at his familiar handwriting. What I discovered inside would become the first piece of a much larger puzzle. For several seconds, I simply stared at the envelope. George's handwriting had always been unmistakable. Strong, deliberate, organized. Even after all those years, seeing it felt like hearing his voice again. I carefully opened the folded paper inside and sat down on the edge of the bed. The document was not a letter. It was a collection of notes. Short observations written over time. Most were dated. Some were not. At first, they appeared unrelated. Then a pattern emerged. George had been documenting concerns about certain conversations, financial requests, and family interactions long before his illness. One note mentioned the importance of keeping copies of major financial records. Another reminded himself never to make emotional decisions when someone was pressuring him. The more I read, the more unsettled I became. None of the notes mentioned Vanessa directly. That would have been impossible because many were written before Ryan even met her. Yet the lessons sounded strangely relevant to everything happening now. One particular sentence caught my attention. Pay close attention to people who benefit from confusion. I read it several times. Something about it lingered in my mind. George had always believed that truth became easier to see when emotions were removed from the equation. He was practical that way. While I often focused on intentions, he focused on patterns. As the night stretched toward morning, I continued sorting through the album. Hidden behind several photographs was another folded sheet. This one contained information about a safety deposit box that I barely remembered. Years earlier, George had rented it through a local bank. After his passing, I assumed everything important had already been removed. Apparently, I had been wrong. The key was listed among his personal effects, along with a note reminding himself to keep certain family records secure. Suddenly, the evening no longer felt like a collection of coincidences. First Helen's call, then the notes, then the forgotten safety deposit box. It felt as though pieces of a puzzle were slowly moving into place. The next morning, I barely slept. Around 8 o'clock, my phone finally rang. This time it was Ryan. For a moment, I considered ignoring the call. Instead, I answered. His voice sounded uncomfortable. He asked whether I had made it home safely after the wedding. The question arrived nearly 12 hours too late. We spoke politely, carefully, like two people trying to avoid a subject sitting directly between them. Not once did he mention what had happened at the reception. Not once did he ask how I felt. By the time the conversation ended, I understood something important. Ryan was not ready to face the truth. Maybe he could not. Maybe he did not want to. Either way, I stopped expecting him to fix anything. After hanging up, I retrieved George's notes once more. For years, I had viewed the past as something finished. Something settled. Now I was beginning to suspect that answers had been waiting there all along. And if the contents of that safety deposit box were as important as George seemed to believe, then my next stop would not be another difficult conversation. It would be the bank. The bank sat only 15 minutes from my house, yet the drive felt much longer. All morning, George's notes replayed in my mind. By the time I walked through the front doors carrying the old paperwork, I was no longer expecting money or valuables. What I wanted were answers. A bank manager escorted me to a private room after verifying my identification and the documents connected to the safety deposit box. Several minutes later, a small metal box rested on the table in front of me. My hands trembled slightly as I unlocked it. Inside were neatly organized folders, exactly the way George handled everything important during his lifetime. The first folder contained copies of family financial records. Nothing unusual. The second held insurance documents and tax information. Then I opened the third folder. That was when I found something unexpected. George had created a timeline. Not a formal document. Just pages of observations written over several years. Dates. Conversations. Decisions. Concerns. Reading through it felt like stepping into his thought process. George had noticed patterns long before I ever did. He documented instances where people presented different versions of the same story, depending on who was listening. He noted situations where misunderstandings seemed to benefit certain individuals. Most importantly, he repeatedly emphasized the importance of verifying facts rather than trusting rumors. One page stopped me cold. Written near the bottom was a reminder to himself. Protect relationships from people who profit from division. I sat back in my chair and stared at those words. Suddenly Helen's call made even more sense. George had never named anyone directly. Yet his observations mirrored the exact concerns she described. As I continued reading, another document slipped from the folder. It was a handwritten letter addressed to me. My chest tightened immediately. George explained that if I was reading the letter, it meant something in the family had gone seriously wrong. He wrote that kindness was one of my greatest strengths, but also one of my greatest vulnerabilities. He warned me not to mistake silence for peace or loyalty for truth. Then came the sentence that affected me most. If people begin telling you who you are, trust your actions more than their words. By the time I finished reading, tears filled my eyes. Not because George had predicted specific events. Because he understood me so well. Leaving the bank, I felt different than I had that morning. Stronger. Clearer. For the first time since the wedding, I stopped focusing on the humiliation itself. Instead, I focused on understanding how things had reached that point. Later that afternoon, Helen called again. This time her voice carried urgency. She had remembered something important. Months earlier, she had seen messages Vanessa sent to another acquaintance. Messages discussing family members. Messages discussing me. Helen believed copies still existed. I stood silently beside my kitchen counter as she spoke. If those messages said what she suspected, then the story I was uncovering was about to move beyond opinions and memories. For the first time, there might be evidence. The evidence arrived 3 days later. Helen called just after lunch and asked whether I could meet her at a small cafe near the courthouse. The seriousness in her voice told me this was not something she wanted to discuss over the phone. When I arrived, she was already seated in a corner booth with a folder resting on the table. She looked nervous. Not frightened. Just uncomfortable. As though she wished none of this had ever happened. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she slid the folder toward me. Inside were printed screenshots of messages exchanged between Vanessa and a former acquaintance. At first, I hoped there had been some misunderstanding. I wanted the messages to be harmless. They were not. The words were impossible to ignore. Over and over again, Vanessa described me as controlling, manipulative, and desperate for attention. She mocked my financial situation. She mocked my appearance. She even joked about how easy it was to influence certain people's opinions once a narrative had been repeated enough times. I felt my chest tighten as I read. Not because the insults were particularly creative. Because they revealed intent. This was not frustration expressed during a difficult moment. This was a pattern. A deliberate effort carried out over years. Helen watched quietly as I turned each page. Eventually she reached across the table and touched my hand. She told me she had struggled with whether to show me the messages. Part of her worried the information would only create more pain. The other part believed I deserved the truth. For the first time since the wedding, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not happiness. Relief. The confusion that had haunted me for years suddenly made sense. The awkward conversations. The distant friendships. The strange assumptions people occasionally made about me. Many of those things had not appeared out of nowhere. Someone had been shaping perceptions behind the scenes. As painful as that realization was, it also freed me from self-doubt. That evening, I spread the messages across my dining room table beside George's notes and the documents from the safety deposit box. Looking at everything together created a clearer picture than any single piece alone. George had taught me to study patterns. Helen had provided context. The messages supplied proof. For the first time, I stopped viewing the wedding as an isolated act of cruelty. Instead, I saw it as the public climax of something that had been developing for years. Later that night, my phone buzzed with a group message. Vanessa was organizing a family dinner the following weekend to celebrate the newlyweds. Several relatives were invited. Ryan encouraged everyone to attend. As I stared at the invitation, a strange feeling settled over me. A week earlier, I would have declined immediately. I would have avoided conflict and stayed home. This time was different. I no longer needed approval. I no longer needed explanations. Most importantly, I no longer feared the truth. Quietly, I replied that I would be there. Then I gathered the folder of messages, George's notes, and the documents I had collected and placed them neatly into a single file. For years, Vanessa had controlled the story people heard about me. At that family dinner, for the first time, everyone was going to hear mine. The family dinner took place the following Saturday evening at a large restaurant on the north side of Columbus. Vanessa had chosen the venue herself. Everything about the event reflected the image she wanted people to see. Elegant table settings, professional lighting, carefully arranged seating. From the outside, it looked like a celebration. As I walked through the entrance carrying my folder, I noticed several relatives already gathered around the private dining area. Conversations paused briefly when they saw me. Then smiles returned. Polite, cautious, curious. I greeted everyone warmly and took my seat. Across the table, Vanessa looked completely confident. She wore the same smile I had seen countless times before. The smile that suggested she already knew how every conversation would end. Ryan sat beside her, appearing tired but hopeful. For a while, everything proceeded normally. Food arrived. People shared stories from the wedding. Laughter drifted through the room. If anyone sensed tension beneath the surface, they pretended not to notice. I remained quiet and listened. Years earlier, I would have felt nervous sitting there. This time, I felt surprisingly calm. The truth has a way of creating peace when you finally stop running from it. About halfway through the evening, Vanessa stood and thanked everyone for attending. She spoke about family, new beginnings, and the future. Several guests applauded politely. Then she glanced in my direction and added a comment about how important it was to move beyond misunderstandings and negativity. The remark sounded harmless. Most people probably interpreted it that way. I recognized it immediately for what it was. Another attempt to shape the narrative without appearing confrontational. Normally, I would have stayed silent. Instead, I gently placed my fork on the table and asked if I could say something. The room grew noticeably quieter. Vanessa nodded with obvious confidence. She expected an apology. Perhaps she expected me to praise the wedding and move on. What she did not expect was for me to calmly remove a folder from my bag. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse anyone of anything. I simply explained that recent events had encouraged me to reflect on several years of family history. Then I began sharing facts. George's notes. Helen's observations. The messages describing me in ways that were completely inconsistent with reality. One by one, I presented the information without emotion, without exaggeration, without anger. Around the table, expressions began changing. People who had been smiling moments earlier now looked thoughtful. Others appeared uncomfortable. A few seemed genuinely surprised. The most revealing reaction came from Vanessa herself. For the first time since I had known her, she looked uncertain. Not because I was attacking her, because she was no longer controlling the story. Ryan remained silent throughout most of the discussion. Yet as document after document appeared, I saw something changing in his expression as well. Confusion gave way to concern. Concern gave way to realization. The evening was no longer unfolding according to Vanessa's plan. And deep down, I suspected she finally understood that the conversation everyone had avoided for years was only beginning. For several seconds after I finished speaking, nobody said a word. The restaurant suddenly felt much quieter than before. Even the background music seemed distant. I looked around the table and saw people processing information they had never heard before. Some stared at the documents. Others avoided eye contact entirely. Vanessa was the first to break the silence. She laughed softly and suggested that everything had been taken out of context. Her voice remained controlled, but I noticed something different beneath it. Uncertainty. Until that moment, she had always been able to dismiss concerns with confidence. This time was different because the evidence existed in front of everyone. The messages were not rumors. The dates were not opinions. The words came directly from her own conversations. One relative quietly asked whether the screenshots were authentic. Before I could answer, Helen spoke from across the table. She explained exactly how the messages had been preserved and where they came from. Her calm explanation carried weight because everyone knew her reputation. She was not someone who exaggerated or created drama. Another family member picked up one of the printed pages and read silently. The expression on his face changed almost immediately. Around the room, similar reactions followed. Nobody appeared angry. Nobody raised their voice. The atmosphere felt far more uncomfortable than anger. It felt like disappointment. Ryan finally spoke. His voice sounded lower than usual. He asked Vanessa a simple question. Had she really written those messages? There was no accusation in his tone. Only sadness. Vanessa hesitated. That hesitation lasted only a few seconds, but it told everyone more than any explanation could have. Eventually, she admitted that some of the messages were hers. Then she quickly began offering reasons. Stress. Misunderstandings. Private conversations never meant to be shared. Excuses filled the space where accountability should have been. I listened quietly. Months earlier, I might have argued. Years earlier, I might have defended myself. Now I felt no need to do either. The documents spoke for themselves. George's notes. Helen's testimony. The messages. Together they revealed a pattern that was difficult to deny. Ryan leaned back in his chair and looked down at the table. I had not seen that expression since he was a teenager. It was the face of someone realizing that a situation was far more complicated than he wanted to believe. One by one, relatives began asking questions. Not hostile questions. Honest ones. Questions about events they now viewed differently. Questions about comments they remembered hearing over the years. With every answer, the picture became clearer. What shocked many of them was not a single message. It was how long the behavior had continued. By the end of the discussion, nobody seemed interested in celebrating anymore. The evening had transformed into something else entirely. Not a confrontation. Not a public punishment. Simply an overdue conversation. As I sat there listening, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. The humiliation I experienced at the wedding no longer felt like the defining moment of the story. It had become the event that finally exposed a much deeper truth. And for the first time in years, that truth was no longer hidden in whispers. It was sitting openly in the light for everyone to see. When the dinner finally ended, nobody rushed toward the exit. People lingered in small groups, speaking quietly among themselves. The atmosphere felt completely different from the one that had existed only a few hours earlier. For years, assumptions had filled the empty spaces where facts should have been. Now those assumptions were gone. I slowly gathered my documents and returned them to the folder. No one tried to stop me. No one challenged what had been presented. The truth had done its work without needing my help. As I stood to leave, he apologized for not speaking up. Most of all, he apologized for failing to listen when I needed him most. I listened quietly. Part of me wished those words had come sooner. Another part understood that growth rarely arrives on our preferred schedule. I told him I loved him. That had never changed. But I also explained that love could not erase consequences. Trust takes years to build. For once, she had nothing to say. No explanation seemed capable of changing what everyone had seen. No carefully crafted story could compete with documented facts. I felt no satisfaction looking at her. No victory. No revenge. The strange thing about finally being understood is that it leaves very little room for bitterness. As I walked toward the restaurant entrance, several relatives stopped me. Some offered apologies. Others admitted they had believed things about me that now seemed unfair. A few simply thanked me for speaking honestly. Their words were kind, but they were not what mattered most. The real change had already happened inside me. Weeks earlier, I thought the greatest loss was the humiliation I experienced at the wedding. I was wrong. The greatest loss would have been allowing that moment to define my worth. Outside, the evening air felt cool and peaceful. I stood beside my car for a moment and looked up at the dark Ohio sky. George's words returned to me once again. Trust your actions more than their words. Throughout my life, I had tried to help people, to support family, to offer kindness whenever possible. One painful event could not erase decades of truth. Several months later, life looked very different. Some relationships healed slowly. Others never returned to what they had once been. That was all right. Not every chapter is meant to continue forever. What mattered was that I stopped carrying the burden of other people's stories about me. I carried my own story instead. Sometimes people ask whether I regret attending that wedding. The answer surprises them. I do not. Because that day revealed everything that needed to be revealed. The dress was inexpensive. The decorations were simple. The venue was modest. None of those things mattered. What mattered was discovering that dignity cannot be purchased, borrowed, or taken away by someone else's opinion. And as I drove home that night, I finally understood something George had known all along. A person's value is not determined by how they are treated. It is determined by how they rise after being tested.